filmmaker. And so first and foremost, that means that you're a storyteller. And your craft demands that you use moving images to tell those stories. And yes, that's moving images, images that are really going to engage and move your audience. Now, every story has a 3-act structure, a beginning, middle and end. And that's very much the 3-act structure that you've heard a lot of filmmakers and screenwriters talk about. Now, the handy filmmaking 101 metaphor for how you can think about your script and your story is to regard your story as a shark. It's got to keep moving forward or it dies. So our 3-act structure is beginning, middle and end. In the simplest of terms, the 3-act structure can be regarded as equilibrium in Act 1, disruption and conflict in Act 2, and the establishment of a new order and new wisdom in Act 3. In Act 1, we establish the setup. Who does our story concern? What is happening? When is it happening? And where is it happening? We establish the characters' motives, ambitions, and desires. The first 5 pages of Act 1 grab the audience's attention and make sure we don't want to walk out of the theatre or turn off the DVD. The inciting incident usually happens between pages 10 to 15, and this is what happens to grab the attention of the main characters. If this doesn't happen, life goes on like it always has and we don't have a story. Around pages 25 to 35, the main character has a big decision to make, and this is the end of Act 1 and the first turning point. The first turning point is a crisis of such magnitude that it fuels the protagonist's journey through the rising conflicts of Act 2. In Act 2, the protagonist, that's the hero or heroine, faces escalating conflict and ever-increasing difficulties. Complications, character exploration, motives, subplots and uncertainty abound. The events of the movie, the character interaction and character reflection bring everything into question. Around halfway through Act 2, we find the midpoint, which is where the story kicks up another gear. This is usually around page 50 to 60 in the average screenplay, and here the movie changes purpose and its true meaning is revealed. It's almost a point of no return. At the end of Act 2, there's a further major turning point, usually around pages 80 to 90 of the screenplay. This is where the main character faces the biggest decision of their life, and usually it's a life or death decision. This propels them into Act 3, which is the building of the drama to a point of climax and resolution. The climax usually happens around 2 to 5 pages before the end of the script. It's a big finish and an end to all the problems. After this climactic resolution to the ongoing conflict of Act 2, the character has now a new set of beliefs based on the movie's events. Or they have the same set of beliefs but have further conviction and wisdom to them. With your newfound knowledge of the principles of the 3-act structure, you're now ready to write your first commercial screenplay. Sadly, that just isn't the case. The problem with how the 3-act structure is often taught and presented is that it suggests that there's a simple formula or an easy magic bullet fix to creating a successful screenplay, and that just isn't true. Yes, screenwriting is a technical craft with practices, principles and guidelines, but it's also an art form which requires originality, inspiration and lots of talent, hard work and rewrites. If you think of Fellini's 8.5 or his Satyricon, Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev, Kubrick's 2001 or Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, there's a range of fantastic movies that bear little or no relation to the 3-act structure as we've looked at it today. It was William Goldman who wrote The Princess Bride, All the President's Men and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, who famously said, after all, when it comes to screenwriting, nobody really knows anything. So please regard the 3-act structure as a set of guiding principles rather than a formula for an easy fix. When setting out to write your screenplay, it's a really good idea to have at least a basic understanding of myth and archetype. After all, myths are stories that have lasted for thousands of years, and the reason why they survive is because they tell us something really important about life and about ourselves. Filmmakers study myths in order to have a much better chance of creating and crafting a really engaging and compelling script. Joseph Campbell was a lecturer and writer who spent decades travelling around the world studying the various mythologies of different cultures. Now, Campbell came to the conclusion that various myths from throughout history shared the same structure and characters, which he referred to as archetypes, and he published his ideas in a famous book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In this and other books, Campbell describes the hero's journey, or the monomyth, found in many varied narratives from around the world, and it goes something like this. A hero or heroine ventures forth from the everyday world into an unknown region of conflict and turbulence. Fabulous forces are encountered, along with new companions, guides, mentors, tricksters and foes. After many increasingly difficult trials and tribulations, and against all odds, a final mighty victory is won, and the hero or heroine returns home stronger and wiser, and above all, fundamentally and eternally changed because of the journey that they've been on. Now, Campbell and some of his colleagues, such as Eric Neumann, cited the narratives of Moses, Buddha and Jesus as examples. Now, these are stories that have founded civilizations and are still alive, powerful and vibrant today. One famous student of Joseph Campbell was George Lucas. Now, when Lucas was writing Star Wars, he recognised that if he adhered closely to Campbell's insights on the hero's journey, it would greatly enhance his chances of creating a script with more universal appeal. In terms of the hero's journey, in Act 1 we see our protagonists in their ordinary world. Then there's a call to adventure. The call to adventure is refused. Then there's a meeting with the mentor. Act 1 ends with the protagonist crossing the threshold. In Act 2, the hero's journey progresses through many tests and ordeals. Allies and enemies are met, there's an approach to the inmost cave, the hero experiences an ordeal, and then there's a reward, or in mythic terms, the sword is seized. In Act 3, the hero returns to the ordinary world stronger and wiser. This is experienced through the road back, a process of resurrection, and the final return with elixir or new powers. Now, in terms of myth and archetype, it has been said by some that essentially every narrative, script or story can be reduced down to one of 7 or more key story archetypes. Now, this may or may not be true, but it's certainly interesting to consider. And an awareness of these 7 key story models may give you a firm foundation upon which to start developing your own story. So as a handy thumbnail, these are 1. Overcoming the monster, 2. Rags to riches, 3. The quest, 4. Voyage and return, 5. Comedies, 6. Tragedies, and 7. Rebirth. So let's have a look at those in slightly more detail. The 7 basic story models can also be outlined as man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature, man versus God, man versus himself, man caught in the middle, and man versus woman. And please forgive the strong gender bias in that model. Obviously, the story archetypes apply to female and male protagonists equally and alike. Screenwriting guru John Truby outlines 7 key components of the anatomy of a story. First, the protagonist must have a weakness or need, as a result of which they formulate a desire to fulfill that need or overcome that weakness. That results in them facing an opponent. To overcome the opponent, they create a plan, which is thwarted, leading to a battle. As a result of the battle, the protagonist experiences a self-revelation or a new insight, which in return leads to a new equilibrium. So let's have a look at a couple of those key points. Firstly, weakness and need. If your protagonist doesn't have any fundamental flaws or weaknesses, there's really no value on them embarking on the hero's journey, as they've got absolutely nothing to learn about life or themselves. Secondly, desire. We already know that the protagonist's desire must be absolutely burning, and the choices that they make have to be life-altering. The opponent. Is your antagonist sufficiently powerful, interesting, and motivated to credibly sustain conflict with the protagonist for up to 90 minutes? And finally, self-revelation. What has your protagonist learnt as a result of embarking upon the hero's journey? Very quickly then, let's have a look at another story generating toolkit, this time created by one of the kings of British television writing, a guy called Tony Jordan, most famous for his sci-fi time-traveling cop show, Life on Mars. So Tony suggests start with character, much like Thomas Hardy, character is fate. So he'll spend maybe 2 weeks creating a really rounded, believable human being. He knows every aspect of their inner and outer life, their social, spiritual, economic, class, sexual life, every aspect of them, to the extent that he will actually apply for jobs in the persona of this character. And he says he really knows that he's got the character right when he starts to get successful responses from prospective employers. Now, the reason for that is that the job application form forces you to think about things that you mightn't ordinarily do so in the process of creating your character. Where were they born? Where did they go to school? What were their co-curricular activities? What has their career trajectory been? Why did they get fired? Why did they leave such and such a job? So on and so forth, okay? Having done so, then set meaningful boundaries for the core values of that character. What is it that they always move towards? What are they motivated towards? And what is it that they always kind of veer away from? So let's take Tony Soprano. He'll always try and move towards being in control and move away from showing any kinds of weakness, and that will manifest both in his personal life and his business life. And in fact, it's that perceived weakness of emotional vulnerability and instability that kicks off the whole story of The Sopranos. Thirdly then, and this marries with a lot of the stuff that we've already looked at together, your protagonist must have, you guessed it, a burning desire. So it's a recurring theme, it's very, very important. Something that compels them to really move forward in life-changing ways and to face difficult decisions. And naturally, that leads us to the final element of conflict, which is absolutely core and critical to all drama. Given that we have a character we know inside out, given that we know their moral and ethical boundaries, and given that they have a burning desire, our job then as a writer is to create amazing, irreconcilable conflicts and make sure that they're increasingly difficult for them to overcome, and just keep throwing these at them. And that starts to create, if you will, a kind of like soup out of which we can boil down the key elements, and our first draft may emerge from that. So a very quick kind of overview. Again, just know the character, set the boundaries, create a burning desire, throw obstacles, and that gives you something to start to work with. Have the courage to fail. Now, I know that that does not sound particularly inspiring, but let's remember that when you're learning this or any new craft or practice, it takes a lot of time to learn and a lifetime to master. I think it was William Goldman or possibly Robert McKee who said that screenwriting is the hardest craft in the world. So you and I need to be very realistic with our own expectations and patient with ourselves throughout the learning process. Tony Robbins described successful people as people who have often failed many times more than everyone else, but they have learnt from their failures, applied their learning to their craft, business or lifestyle, and kept moving forward. Discipline yourself to knuckle down and actually do the writing. I know that sounds silly, but the fact is that it's very easy for us to get caught up in the fantasy of being a writer or being an actor or filmmaker, and much more difficult to actually go and do the long hours required on our own and discipline and motivate ourselves. It's very much like getting fit. You know, you can watch all the great instructional and motivational DVDs, you can read all the right books, you can go and kit yourself out in the most expensive jogging gear, but until you actually get your butt off the couch and get out for a run or down to the gym 3 to 5 times a week, nothing's going to change at all. Treat your writing as a job. Whether or not you feel motivated, inspired, punch in, punch out, and do the hours. Before you even start writing, decide what genre best suits your story, and then thoroughly study the codes and conventions of that genre. Genre is a French word meaning type or kind, and obviously there are many different genres of film, such as horror, science fiction, comedy, western, musical, film noir, historical epic, documentary, and so on. Each have their own specific protocols and guidelines. Likewise, if you're writing for television, there are other forms to consider. The soap opera, the procedural crime show, the seasonal drama, whose story arc unfolds maybe over 10 to 12 45-minute to 1 hour episodes, the sitcom, which is a craft in its own right, and increasingly reality TV shows. And sorry for the spoiler, but yes, they are written. Now, if we were to take the case of film noir, for example, this was the great crime and detective genre of America in the 30s, 40s and 50s, and then revitalised, of course, with neo-noir. The codes and conventions there suggest that we might have a grisly murder, a very moody, dramatic, low-key lighting style, the sexual allure and danger of the femme fatale, or deadly woman, and a kind of moral and ethical murkiness that afflicts not only the villain but also the hero of the piece and pervades the whole mood of the film itself. Now, LA Confidential is a great case in point, but as with all these things, there are exceptions. Polanski's Chinatown is often regarded as one of the greatest noirs ever made, but in it, Polanski makes the brilliant choice of using high-key, bright lighting style to suggest the oppressive glare of the LA sun baking down on the characters of the movie as they sweat out their grubby conflicts. If you or I were to write a noir that didn't have any of those key ingredients, it would be akin to hosting a dinner party and managing to serve a spaghetti bolognese that had no spaghetti, meatballs, tomato sauce, basil, or parmesan. There really wouldn't be any immediate rush to invite us to host a dinner party again anytime soon. Yes, it is of course possible, though not very easy, to blend genres when writing your screenplay. City Slickers was a very successful film that was, on the one hand, a buddy-buddy comedy caper, a rites of passage, if you will, for some very spoilt 30-something urbanites, and clearly a western drawing on that genre's fascination with notions of manliness and self-reliance, as well as the transformative relationship between man, nature and the landscape. It also boasted an outstanding performance from Jack Palance, an icon of the western genre, as Curly, the weather-beaten cowboy. Palance was of course famous for his unforgettable portrayal of the murderous gunslinger in the 1953 classic Shane. Ridley Scott's Blade Runner is another fascinating case in point. Scott sets out to draw upon a number of genres in creating a unique texture for his movie. Of course, Blade Runner is a science fiction film. It's set in the future, has amazing futuristic technologies, androids, robots, blasters, so on and so forth. But it's also very clearly and consciously a noir movie, with its brutal slayings, Sean Young as the definitive femme fatale, and Harrison Ford's Deckard as a textbook noir detective. Scott's vision of a futuristic LA is a murky mix of steam, rain, glass and neon, perfectly offset by Vangelis's outstanding score, which mixed electronic synthesized sounds with the more plaintive downtown nighttime vibe of the saxophone. Fascinatingly, Blade Runner can also be seen as a religious film because it deals directly with the urgent need for a meaningful relationship between the creation and its creator. Now, that's a theme that can be traced back through science fiction to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Milton's Paradise Lost, the Greek Prometheus myth, and back indeed to the sacred scriptures of nearly every spiritual tradition. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, Blade Runner did not fare well at the box office. Audiences were underwhelmed and disappointed by the mix of genres, and perhaps more importantly, by the confusing and underdeveloped storyline. Build your story structure before you even start to write draft one. Using little post-it notes, write out the key beats for each scene or event, but don't include any dialogue. When you've done this for the entire story, stick all the little post-its to a wall, desk or flat surface. And that way you can overview the entire architecture of your screenplay with a single glance, instead of having to laboriously read through on a line-by-line basis. Now, this also allows you to very quickly and easily edit and rearrange the building blocks of your narrative, and as such provides a very strong engineering foundation upon which you can then approach building the first draft of your screenplay. Don't underestimate your audience. They're smarter than you think. Now, the reason why is they've seen many thousands upon thousands of studio quality films in their lives. So your film has got to really engage them and surpass their expectations, certainly within the first 10 minutes, or they'll simply turn off. Now, the success of beautifully written shows like The West Wing, The Sopranos, Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad show that in many instances audiences are preferring this type of progressive, intelligent writing for television than the staid formulas of the summer blockbuster. Probably the single most important golden rule of screenwriting is show, don't tell. Now, in other words, that simply means use the actor's performance, their body language, gesture and movement, together with the mise-en-scène, that's everything you see within the frame, including the locations, sets, costume, props, lighting style and colour palette and so on, to show what's happening inside the character rather than resorting to have them use dialogue to tell us. So for example, if we see John come home from the office, sweaty, bedraggled, he loosens his tie, collapses into the chair with a sigh of exhaustion, we don't need any dialogue from John establishing in the audience that he's tired. You've already done that using moving images and sound. When you're writing your screenplay, write it as a silent movie. Put all thoughts of dialogue out of your mind for the time being. That can be added later. That way you can be sure that your story is working visually and that you're moving characters through the story using a series of moving images based on a solid foundation of story structure. When Robert McKee is working with Hollywood screenwriters, he says it's often the fourth draft of a feature before they even start to talk about how the dialogue might work. Get in late and get out early. It's an old screenwriting adage, but what does it mean? Well, it's really saying write with maximum narrative economy. Keep it lean, only put in what needs to be there. In order to do this, you need to be really clear on how your scene is working. How are you using conflict to create changes in the key values of your characters? Once you're clear on that, then you can cut out any preamble from the start or trim off any unnecessary flab from the end of the scene. Always ask yourself, have my characters changed throughout the course of the scene? If not, the scene isn't working and it should be cut from the script. Once the scene has fulfilled its purpose, it's time to move on. We've talked already a fair bit about needs, desires and burning desires, so on and so forth, in terms of propelling your protagonist through the story. But it's important that we make the distinction between conscious desires on the behalf of the protagonist and their actual unconscious needs. Again, going back to Luke Skywalker as our handy reference point, Luke Skywalker's conscious desire in the story is of course to become a Jedi warrior like his father. But his unconscious need is very much just to simply grow up. He lacks the maturity and wisdom to know what it is that he even really wants. And so in embarking on the hero's journey, he goes through that process in a meaningful way. Take Jake LaMotta in Scorsese's 1980 Raging Bull. The burning desire is to be master of the domain, the best boxer in the world, in charge of family, friends, and so on and so forth, to become the ultimate alpha male. But in actual fact, the unconscious need is desperately powerful, wherein the character really needs to find some means of expressing himself other than violence. Another golden rule of screenwriting is don't direct. Your job is to create a wonderful, compelling story which is then handed over to the actors, crew and director to bring to life. So don't use brackets or parentheticals to indicate to actors how they should deliver the line. Actors are intelligent, professional people who simply don't need you or me directing them from the page. And likewise, never ever tell a director how he or she should move the camera through the scene. In both instances, these are dead giveaway hallmarks of an amateur writer. Put love in your story. Now, that doesn't mean that your screenplay should be necessarily a romantic comedy, romantic or sexual love. But it could be love for an idea, a place, a belief, a thing, a heritage, a pastime or an activity. So in the case of Top Gun, the movie's ignited in a very cinematic way by the protagonist's love for flying. In Babette's Feast, it's Babette's passion and love for cooking that introduces a whole community of very spiritual but ultimately dry and repressed Puritans to the possibilities of enjoying the pleasures of physical life. Love's at the very core of who we are as human beings, and so it's really got to shine out of the lives of your characters too. But in story terms, that can only be really proven and demonstrated by seeing them overcome conflict and having to make difficult choices. Romeo and Juliet wouldn't be the quintessential love story if their union hadn't been forbidden by their respective families. And in the case of the protagonist in Chariots of Fire, he has to resolve a conflict between two loves within himself. His love and devotion to his Christian faith, which forbids him to practice his craft on a Sunday, and also his love for his sport and his country, which requests him to run on the Christian Sabbath. Invest the time to carefully consider and create the perfect premise logline for your story. This is a sentence, or two at most, that really boils down the key theme at the heart of your piece. Screenwriters refer to this, in Robert McKee's terms, as the controlling idea, the core central dramatic theme at the heart of your screenplay. In the case of The Godfather, for example, it might be something like, despite having vowed a life of peace, can Michael Corleone keep family, friends and soul intact as he avenges the murder of his brother? Now, obviously that's a not too great example that I've created just off the cuff, but even in that one sentence you can see that there's plenty of conflict to explore throughout the course of a story. There's Michael's internal conflict between his aspirations for a peaceful life for himself, his wife and his children, and yet set against that are the expectations, pressures and obligations of his broader family, his associates and the tradition that he's part of. As he moves through these very, very difficult personal decisions, the internal conflicts manifest in the outer world as betrayal, torment, murder, intrigue and so forth. And we see dramatised how difficult it is for Michael to escape the quicksand of life in the mafia. Now, once you have your carefully considered perfect premise logline, write it out on a little bit of post-it, stick it on your monitor, on your desk, somewhere that you're going to see it every time you come to write. That way you force yourself to stay on track thematically throughout the many detours of the writing and rewriting process. Consider Robert McKee's suggestion that writers think less in terms of scenes in the traditional sense and more in terms of events. Now, events are significant changes in the life situation of your characters as he or she experiences value changes as a result of internal and external conflict. There might be 40 to 60 such events in the course of an average film. Now, McKee suggests that the writer seeks out events because events generate imagery, action, mood, dialogue, symbolism, and so forth. Secondly, events are caused by and happen to people and are therefore the perfect way to delineate and to define character. Finally, events happen in specific locations, and these settings inform the way in which imagery, mood, and action are generated. The question really becomes, what do I include in the event and what do I exclude from it? And in order to answer that question, one's got to be really clear about the purpose of the scene or event in terms of how it's moving your shark forward through the water. What do I put before the event? What do I put after it? Again, reflect carefully on where you put the event as a building block within the overall architecture of your narrative. Don't give your characters an easy way out. They've got to really work to attain their burning desires and face many conflicts along the way. So give them really difficult choices: the rock or the hard place, the frying pan or the fire, the big promotion with the penthouse office, or their self-respect and integrity. Training Day is an excellent case in point. In that movie, Ethan Hawke's rookie cop character has to choose between betraying every value he has ever held dear, or entering into a criminal pact with the devil, played by Denzel Washington, in exchange for the status and salary and respect that he's always so desperately craved. Really develop your secondary characters. They should be engaging, nuanced and authentic. Their choices, actions and reactions serve as a foil and dramatic counterpart to those of the protagonist and antagonist, and as such enrich the flavours of your story. So in the case of Star Wars, we see Luke Skywalker's youthful idealism and dangerous naivety all the more clearly because of Obi-Wan Kenobi's wisdom and experience, Han Solo's cynical worldly-wise charm, Chewbacca's primal energy, C-3PO's prissy, nervous quality, and the robotic charm of the feisty little R2-D2. Choose the verb that best describes the action and mood of your scene, and avoid neutral and bland verbs. For example, John enters the room. Well, that pales in comparison to the storytelling potential of John strides into the room, or John sneaks into the room, John collapses into the room. Clearly, in each instance, John has entered the room, but simply by choosing a more effective verb, we've enhanced our understanding of character and action without having resorted to long descriptive overwriting. Now that it's time to start thinking about writing dialogue, there's a couple of things to consider. First and foremost, never ever write on the nose. Now, writing on the nose is when your characters say exactly what they think or feel in the most bland and straightforward way in any given situation or context, and this immediately strips any scene of subtext, subtlety or nuance, and it's the hallmark of a writer who's too lazy to find interesting or inventive ways to give expositional information. Keep your dialogue, as an actor might say, in character at all times. In other words, ask yourself, does this dialogue really ring true for this character, given their region, their dialect, their age group, their vocabulary, and their social and class background? Does it make sense within the context in which they're interacting with the other characters in the scene? We know very well that the subject matter and tenor of conversation with our friends in the bar on Friday night, it may be rather different from how we choose to express ourselves at a polite family gathering with Great Aunt Margaret. Also, just check that the dialogue makes sense and is consistent within the context of the character's mental, emotional and physical state. Personally, this is one reason why I've always found the ending of James Cameron's Titanic rather less than convincing. Remain open to the magic and mystery of the creative process. Now, so far we've put a fair amount of emphasis on structure, technique and storycraft, but we've got to remain open to the possibilities and surprises that will present themselves throughout the creative process. For example, you may discover halfway through draft 3 that the real story belongs to, let's say, character C, and not protagonist A, whose story you've been developing studiously for the past 2.5 or 3 months. Writing is an inherently creative process, obviously, and as such it can't be shoehorned into an off-the-shelf, one-size-fits-all story template. Learn to deal with rejection. Rejection, unfortunately, is just an inevitable part of being a filmmaker and screenwriter. It doesn't necessarily mean that your script or project isn't any good. It may be that there's a glut on that particular idea or theme, or that there simply isn't any demand for it at the moment. Likewise, your project may be lacking a key relationship or finance that would otherwise just kick it into gear. We can take some solace from the fact that artistic and financially successful filmmakers still find getting many of their projects very difficult to get off the ground, and they too face rejection on a near daily basis. If you're lucky enough to get offered constructive criticism and feedback, consider it very seriously and apply it where relevant to your project. If you want to work professionally, you need to understand what's required to get work. When I worked as a script reader for the BBC, our department over a 10-year period read something like 10,000 unsolicited scripts, out of which one got made. So you've got to know the ways to stack the odds in your favour. In writing for television, for example, really the consensus is that the only way to get a foot in the door is to write a spec script for a pre-existing show. Don't waste your time trying to create an amazing format for a new drama series until you have credibility within the industry. To write a good spec script, you've obviously got to know the show and care about it. You've got to understand the characters and understand the story structure of the show that you want to work on. Additionally, you must format it properly. Again, as with film, your first 3 to 5 pages are the make and break. The people that read your scripts are extremely busy, and by page 3, page 5, page 10 at the absolute outside, they'll have decided very clearly and based on plenty of experience whether or not your script is worth passing on up the food chain. With film, the path to getting work is a little bit more vague, but the consensus seems to be not to try and preempt what you think is going to be popular a year or two down the line. Everybody seems to agree that it's anybody's guess. Write something that comes from your heart but still has craft and remembers to entertain the audience as a storyteller. That's your first duty. It's a really good idea if you can have a couple of excellent quality shorts on YouTube. That way you have an excellent calling card. When you have a point of contact, you can follow through with a top-class, properly formatted script.